Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. Nice full room. And in addition, we have a couple hundred people on Zoom listening in as well. Welcome to this Hauser Symposium. And first, I'd like to thank Rita Hauser, of course, whose guidance and support make such a lasting impact on this institution. She established the Hauser Symposium almost 2 decades ago to focus the council each year on a defining challenge or opportunity facing the United States. And the subjects have ranged broadly from the domestic evolution in China to the access of autocracies. This is the 18th symposium, and this year's theme is particularly fitting, America at 250. This is part of our broader America at 250 set of programming that we're doing. There's no question that we're at a historic inflection point, but the debate over America's role in the world is, in some ways, nothing new. Our founding fathers warned against entangling alliances, and many would be called isolationists by today's standards. The 19th century brought territorial expansionism and his hemispheric dominance. Sounds kind of familiar. And the 20th century offered hard lessons of its own, from the isolationist instincts of post-World War I to neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and now America First. In other words, these core questions we're wrestling with today have been around for most, if not all, of America's 250-year history. And of course, the Council has been there at critical moments. In the 1920s, we were founded after the First World War, after the defeat in the Senate of the League of Nations, to fight against the notions of isolationism. In the post-war period, we played a critical role in the foundation of NATO and the Marshall Plan. At the 1950s and 60s, a young academic from Harvard named Henry Kissinger came down and worked on what became America's nuclear strategy. And in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, the Council helped develop the concept of geoeconomics, the convergence of geopolitics and international economic policy. Today's symposium will deal with all of these issues at 3 panels: post-war choices, embracing global engagement after 1945, the lost promise of the post-Cold War era, and the Trump era and the future of the U.S.-led order. This symposium is on the record, as Stacy said, and it's my privilege to introduce the first panel. We're joined by Rana Mitter, S.T. Lee Professor of U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard's Kennedy School, CFR's own Ben Steele, Senior Fellow and Director of International Economics, Jeremy Suri on the screen virtually, Mac Brown, Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs and Professor of Public Affairs and History at University of Texas, Austin, and our presider. We're delighted to have Amy Davidson Sorkin, staff writer for The New Yorker. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, and welcome to the first session of today's symposium titled Post-War Choices, Embracing Global Engagement After 1945. As Mike mentioned, I'm Amy Davidson Sorkin, a staff writer at The New Yorker, CFR member. And I, too, would like to thank Rita Hauser and the Hauser Foundation for making this symposium possible. As Mike mentioned, we have 3 sessions today, which generally follow the trajectory of American power from 1945 to the 90s and then to the present. And our part, as you can tell from the title, really sets the terms for the ones that follow. Put another way, for those who are familiar with the metaphor that Mark Carney used in his speech at Davos of a sign in the window that he thought might now be taken down about a rules-based order, our session is a bit about how that sign got written, composed, and hung up in all those windows. So with that, then let me begin with you. Our path through this period is going to be, as the title suggests, American choices. And it's choices after 1945, which was itself an incredibly eventful year. Yalta, Hiroshima, in the beginning of this flowering of international institutions. So could you help us situate ourselves? It's the beginning of 1946. How unsettled is the world and the United States' place in it? Was the choice that there should even be all of these world organizations even obvious.
Yeah. 1946 really represents a watershed. It's really the beginning of the end for Roosevelt's so-called one world foreign policy vision during the war. This was the idea that the United States was somehow going to find a way to continue its alliance with the Soviet Union, to bring about a collective security regime, free trade, stable finance. But all that began to collapse in late 45. The Soviets had actually sent technocrats to Bretton Woods, for example, in 1944. So you've got in 45, you've got the UN being established, the IMF, the World Bank. But at the end of 1945, the Soviets back out. They don't ratify the agreement. Early 46, you have 3 major speeches back to back that really define the beginning of the Cold War and the end of FDR's one world vision. And on February 9th, Stalin makes his famous Bolshoi speech in which he attacks capitalism and its twin brother, imperialism. 2 weeks later, you have George Kennan's long telegram, which argues that it is impossible to have any sort of collective security arrangement with the Soviets. They are inherently expansionist, both by geography and ideology. 2 weeks after that, you have Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, in which he argues that communist fifth fronts are being created in Western and Southern Europe. So this is really a watershed moment. We have, as I said, the one world vision had already coalesced around some key institutions. We don't yet have what Charles Bolin, the Sovietologist at the State Department, would call in 47 a two-world model. So that's yet to be created. It's created on the fly in 47.
And also, because I think it's, we look at Europe now, it's so distant from us. What was the situation like? I mean, it's easy enough to talk about all these conference rooms, but on the ground, it wasn't just Germany that was full of trouble.
It was catastrophic. There was a humanitarian crisis across the entire continent. The entire division of labor that these sophisticated capitalist economies had depended on had broken down entirely. And so food, to the extent that it was being produced, was not being shipped to the cities because the cities had nothing to offer in return. You had massive reprisals, one group against another, across the entire continent. Tens of thousands of people died in 1946 from these internecine rivalries. By the time you get to the end of 46, we also have a winter catastrophe, the most brutal winter that the century had seen, which finally convinced the United States that it couldn't remain remote from what was going on there.
So, Rana, 1946, specifically, can you take us to January 17th, 1946? The United Nations Security Council convenes for the first time in London. One of the members of the Permanent Five, the Republic of China, is still engaged in a civil war. I mean, we have one, the world at peace, but in rubble. But really, there was still a war going on there. How did the early choices the United States made with regard to China shape the great power relations that followed?
Well, it was a crucial set of choices, Amy, because in a sense, the reason why it's important to answer that question is that it leads us through the key matter of this seminar throughout the day, where we're going to end up, of course, with the US's choice being how to deal with China as the greatest geopolitical challenge that it has in the early 21st century. And yet the China that people looked at in 1946 as one of the first members of that new United Nations General Assembly would not have occurred to anyone as a future superpower. And yet actually the seeds were all there. That's why it was important. I would say, picking up on what Ben's just said, that the way to understand China's role at that time is as an anomaly, as a contradiction. Because the contradiction is that at that moment, in January 1946, China was simultaneously weaker and stronger than it had been at any time in its history for 100 years. The weak part, in a sense, is easy to see because, rather like the Europe that you described, actually tens of millions of people were starving to death in China because of the effects of the 8 years of savage war between China and Japan. In fact, the same organization, the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration,
Which is a new organization.
new organization founded in 1943, US leadership, US money, but actually I think 35 or 40 different countries are involved. And what's sometimes forgotten is it didn't just save Europe, it also put huge amounts into China as well. I think about $600 million at the time. But it also helped to deal with the fact that mass starvation, malnutrition, displacement were shaping the China at that time. And that's not surprising if you very briefly just think about figures that aren't well enough known, perhaps. China fought longer in World War II than any other Allied power, 1937 to 1945, 2 years earlier than Europe went to war. Something like 8, 10, or even more million Chinese died, either directly or as a result of the war. That includes a famine, for instance, that killed 4 million people. And 80 to 100 million people became refugees within China out of a population of 600 million. So this was a country that was on its knees in many ways. You can see why it's weak. But I also said it's stronger at this point than it's ever been before, because it was a country that had insisted on fighting back against Japan, become part of the Allied nations after 1941, after Pearl Harbor, and ended up as one of the winning allies. And therefore, not least thanks to FDR's intervention, it was made one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council at that moment. So the Chinese delegates who were there knew that they were there for the long term. What they didn't know was that the communist revolution was going to kick them out within about 4 years from that particular moment. And it would take a very long and winding path before China re-entered the United Nations. A man called Richard Nixon, who I think is pretty familiar to many people here, and others, Mao and Zhou Enlai, would be involved in that process too. But nonetheless, it's worth remembering that entry of China onto the global top table happens at that moment in 1946. And just one very quick example of how it matters in terms of that globality. That China, under the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek, was very insistent that not only would they think about China and Asia, they would think about the world. And they spent quite a long time talking to people like James Burns, the US Secretary of State, Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, about what China could contribute to reshaping the Balkans and Libya and other places that in that European sphere that were in turmoil. Now, Bevin and Burns gave Wang Shijie, the Chinese foreign minister, pretty short shrift. But the point was that even that early, he made the case that if you Westerners think you can reshape Asia, that's fine. But we Asians also have a role in reshaping the world. And that includes your part of the world.
Amy, can I just jump in for a second? We often lose sight of the fact how close we came to military conflict in 1946. The Soviets invade Manchuria in August of 45. They had claimed that they were going to leave within a few months, but they don't actually leave until May of the following year. They rampaged through Manchuria. They put hundreds of thousands of troops on the Turkish border and pressed territorial claims against Turkey that were a direct threat to our communications. And they refused to withdraw troops from northern Iran, where they were seeding a separatist movement. So we have this, it's a strange situation where we're inaugurating these great new institutions that were supposed to lead to, free trade, stable finance, collective security.
Yeah.
And Truman actually sends a military flotilla to the Mediterranean in the spring of 46 to warn the Soviets.
It's interesting also that some of these decisions about China were being made with nationalist China in mind, that the idea of what China's position would be, that still relevant.
Well, yes, Ben wrote a fantastic book on Henry Wallace called The World That Wasn't, which I highly recommend to everyone. And there's actually...
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay,
too.
wait, no, I'm just doing a plug here, a plug here from my distinguished fellow panelist. But another world that wasn't was one that was being planned for Asia after 1945. Because the assumption on all sides, including on the part of Stalin, was actually that nationalist China would be around for a long time to come. And so if you think about that world, it is a world in which nationalist China is oriented towards the United States. Yes, it has an agreement with the Soviets. And in fact, Stalin basically had the Chinese delegation, people like TV Song, Jiang Tingfu, and others, come to Moscow in August 1945. He did the Stalin thing of waiting to start negotiations at midnight, not giving them any food, and then insisting they sign all the papers before he gave them any breakfast.
We give you all food here.
Oh, that's too. But no. Everyone gets fed here, obviously. But in that world, Stalin got various concessions, including port rights in Manchuria. The possibility of war was real, but in the end, I think he wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union could regroup as well. But he also did that on the assumption actually the Americans would really have the major influence in post-war China. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek had already actually called possibly the most unlikely character you could think of to help him in reconstructing China. And that was General Okamura Yasuji, the commander-in-chief of Japanese ground forces in China during World War II, who was going to be rapidly forgiven and essentially made part of an anti-communist force within China. That would have been alongside of Japan, which then, as now, would have been pro-American. The colonial powers, of course, were back in Southeast Asia, the British in Malaysia, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Indochina. That Asia is one that would have left very little space for Stalin, which is one of the reasons he was so obsessed with making sure that Eastern Europe came under his fall. So the Chinese Civil War and the Chinese Communist victory in 1949 came as a bonus, but an unexpected bonus for Stalin.
Jeremy, I just want to bring you in. It's easy for us to talk about the United States doing this or deciding this or making this choice, but we are imperfectly a democracy. Was Congress in the late 40s embracing global engagement? Was the public?
So one of the biggest transformations that occurred after World War II was the movement of Congress from an isolationist consensus. Let's remember, this is the same Congress that had passed 3 sets of neutrality legislation that made it very difficult for Roosevelt to aid England and Russia. It was very hard for him to get Lend-Lease aid through Congress, for example. It was the same Congress with people like Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan and various others who believed that the United States should, first of all, be fiscally careful in how it spends its money, and was skeptical of an American role beyond North America. It took a lot of work for a very weak president in Harry Truman, who had come into office after Roosevelt's death and was questioned by many in his capabilities. Truman looks much better in retrospect than he did at the time. It was very complicated and difficult for Harry Truman to convince Congress. What he did is he relied on the military establishment and the diplomatic establishment of the United States. And you had extensive conversations between people like then Secretary of State George Marshall, who, of course, had overseen the military effort during the war, Dwight Eisenhower, and various other figures who worked very closely along with diplomats like James Burns and others to convince members of Congress that it made sense for the United States to make what were unprecedented commitments. It's important to remember the United States had not been part of an alliance formally. Even though we were part of a grand alliance in World War II, we had really not been part of a peacetime alliance since the Revolutionary War. There was a strong argument, a strong dogma in American thinking, particularly in Congress, particularly in places like the Midwest, that the United States doesn't join foreign alliances. And it took a lot of work to convince Congress. What was key, and I think the point, Amy, that we need to remember is every big decision after World War II went through Congress and was deeply changed by congressional opinion. That includes NATO, that includes the Marshall Plan. All of the major landmark Cold War decisions that I would say structured the world in a very beneficial way for the United States for the next 50 years, those all required Congress. They all had congressional fingerprints on them. It made no sense in anyone's eyes to delegate this to an executive alone, particularly an executive like Harry Truman.
Is winning over Congress, though, the same as winning over the public? Was there...
Well, I mean, yes and no. There certainly was a sense that members of Congress would lead the public as much as they would respond to the public. But we also have to remember, Amy, this was a period when most Americans had been involved in the war in one way or another. It's so different from today. The war was not something that happened over there, it was something that happened here as well as over there. And even though there was congressional leadership that was often a step ahead of the public, particularly on the Marshall Plan, and certainly in what Ben has written about, most Americans were not following the negotiations at Bretton Woods very carefully. Nonetheless, there was a sense of understanding that the average American, although less educated than the average American today, a sense of understanding of war and the post-war order because of their experience, either in the European theater or the Pacific theater. When you fight a long war, as we had, that is truly a popular war, you have a popular connection to the post-war order that, quite frankly, we haven't had since then.
Ben, George Marshall has come up. Take us to March 1947. George Marshall was then Secretary of State, gets on a plane to Moscow. He spends several weeks there for a foreign ministers conference. When he returned, he had a quite striking diagnosis. He said, the patient is sinking while the doctors deliberate.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that? What did he see there? How did that change his choice, his sense of what our choices
This, to
were?
me, when I was researching my Marshall Plan book, I was surprised to come to this conclusion that this is truly the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviets actually didn't take the Truman Doctrine speech in March terribly seriously. I was surprised to see that in the Soviet archives. They viewed it as a sort of obnoxious restatement of US Mediterranean policy. That was it. But Marshall spends 6 weeks in Moscow in March and April of 47, negotiating mostly with Molotov and then with Stalin, and comes home firmly concluding that cooperation with the Soviets is impossible, that Stalin is absolutely determined to drag Germany and all of Western Europe into chaos, and this was a direct threat to American security and prosperity. And so when he came home, he made an address to the nation in which he pretty much made clear that this was the end of the Yalta-Potsdam cooperation with the Soviets, that the United States was going to secure its interests on its own. Interestingly enough, the Soviets had not yet become convinced that cooperation was finished. I actually found in the Soviet archives some documents indicating that as late as May of 47, Stalin was instructing a Soviet negotiating team to reach agreement with the Americans on creation of a unified interim government in Korea. This was not because Stalin was in some sort of kumbaya moment, but he was focused entirely on Germany. He was very afraid of the United States creating a capitalist democracy in Germany. Well, the beginning of the Cold War comes after Marshall's speech at Harvard, which really does shock the Soviets. Initially, they're not sure how to respond to it. Maybe this will be another Lend-Lease plan where we'll get all this free aid from the United States with no conditions. But pretty soon they come to understand that the US is not, as in World War I, going to go home. It's there to stay.
This is the doctors are deliberate. What are the what's the medicine?
So the medicine, this is quite interesting because the idea behind the Marshall Plan is that if we give the Europeans enormous financial aid to reconstruct their productive capacity as quickly as possible, they will be able to provide for their own security. We want to keep bringing the troops home and keep them home. It does not work out that way at all. The Europeans in particular, the French and the British, were absolutely adamant that if they were going to go forward with this wild American idea to integrate the European economies, They weren't going to be self-sufficient. They weren't going to be able to provide for their own security. What are we going to do, the French said, quite reasonably, in 5 years' time when you've withdrawn all your troops from Germany and Germany refuses to provide us with coal? This wasn't just about the Soviets. It was fear of Germany. So interestingly enough, a year and a day after the Marshall Aid legislation is passed, so that's April of 48, the NATO Founding Act is created. The NATO, and Jeremy, of course, is going to speak on this, NATO was in effect the military escort for the Marshall Plan aid.
Just one word on General Marshall. When he was making that speech, he'd come, of course, off 1 full year absolutely fruitless negotiations in China. One historian has said,
Which really affected his mindset.
This is the thing. He spent a year in China trying to get the communists, the nationalists, to sort out a coalition government. Dan Kurtz-Phelan of this parish, of course, has written a wonderful book, The China Mission, on that. And another historian has basically just described Marshall as having, quotes, a most miserable year in China. But the note I'll pass it back to you on it, Amy, is that Wang Shijie, the foreign minister who I've mentioned before, in his diary, he sees the reports of the Marshall Aid speech and basically writes very, very bitterly, this is what they'll do for Europe. They won't do anything like this for China. But of course, at that point, the Truman administration and Marshall had decided essentially that if China wasn't exactly a hopeless case, it was going to have to fight out its own disputes, and they would no longer be committed there. That then, of course, flags forward to another part of Asia, which is Korea.
Which is Korea. So, Jeremy, pick up there, because it's really, when we talk about NATO, it wasn't really until Korea that NATO came together as a military organization. Is that right? Do you want to talk about that birth of NATO and that?
Sure. It's a really important point. NATO comes out of the Europeans. It's the Europeans who asked for NATO. Ernest Bevin, who's the English foreign minister, is actually the most important motivating figure behind this. And the argument by Bevin and others, Konrad Adenauer and various others, is that the Europeans need some guarantee that the United States will stay in, that the Soviets will stay out, and then they don't say it, but it's to keep the Germans down. This is attributed to Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO. It captures what NATO is about. It's initially a political alliance that is designed to provide military guarantees, but there isn't an initial consensus as to how it will work. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower, as the first Supreme Allied Commander, after he leaves his brief presidency at Columbia, right, he ends up playing the really important role in defining what NATO will be in terms of its military structure. But the Korean War changes everything. The historian Ernest May used to say that the Korean War was really the beginning of the Cold War, because that's the moment when the United States moves from a position that's still committed to demilitarization. We had withdrawn our forces from the Korean Peninsula. Acheson had given a speech in early 1950, the Secretary of State, articulating that the United States would not get in a land war in Asia. By the way, still a pretty good position to take. And the United States was demilitarizing. The emphasis was still on going back to what would be a less militarized posture in the world. NATO becomes central after the start of the Korean War to an effort by American and European decision makers to create a larger standing military force, particularly a ground force, because of the perception that if the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans will invade in South Korea, then it's a realistic possibility that they will invade through the Fulda Gap or some other area in Europe. And that's the movement toward creating the Bundeswehr, which was unthinkable in 1949, but seemed necessary in 1955, that you would actually create a new West German military as an anchor, as it remains today when we think about Ukraine, in the European defense structure. So the Korean War really shifts the emphasis, and it shifts what's acceptable. What had been verboten now becomes necessary, with evidence of clear communist aggression on the Korean Peninsula.
So just one of you, maybe Ben, do you want to say a little something about that moment in, I guess, 1955 when West Germany becomes part of NATO?
Well, that's another watershed, of course, because just a few years earlier, the French are arguing that the Germans are a major security threat.
The French haven't even worked out what's the Saarland. It's
Absolutely, and the
borders,
French,
too.
I should emphasize, in '46 were almost as ruthless occupiers of Germany as the Soviets. The American military governor in Germany, Lucius Clay, initially started out as being strongly anti-French and relatively pro-Soviet. That, again, all changed in 1947. But it was impossible for the French to imagine in 46, 47 that they would be in a military alliance with Germany in just a few short years.
Rana, part of the response to the horrors of the Second World War was war crimes trials in Nuremberg and less well known, I think, here in Tokyo. The U.S. played a major role in both. How did those shape kind of the order that followed, both, in terms of a international idea of justice and power relations?
Absolutely. So there's a very interesting moment that starts with much of Asia being united in that post-war moment, and then which rapidly splits. And that is the Tokyo war crimes trial. An earlier book from the 1970s, I think, called by Arnold Brackman, called it The Other Nuremberg, to kind of make the comparison. There's actually a recent fantastic book by Gary Bass, known to many here, I think, called Judgment Tokyo, which does a really in-depth archival study of the judges and the context in which they made their judgments on Japanese war crimes at the time. And the establishment of this court was a very important thing because, of course, a lot of people, including, I think, actually General MacArthur, wanted to basically just take the Japanese leaders who had been defeated and kind of shoot them out of hand. And it was stressed that it was very important there should be a process in which justice was seen to be done, and also that there were judges from Asia, a judge from India, a judge from the Philippines, and a judge from China. And these three countries, two of them former colonies, and one of them a country that had a sort of semi-colonial status, China, were very much part of that structure, showing that the old era of Western empire simply ruling China was moving on. And yet, although the judgment was made, with the exception of the Indian judge, Radha Vinod Pal, who declared that, in fact, the Japanese leaders were not guilty, and that caused a huge sort of scandal in many ways, that this was going to be the sort of setting place for, setting stones for an Asia that would be ruled by this kind of rule of law. And in Japan, I think it's fair to say that the system that emerges after the end of the American occupation after 1952 brings about a combination of reconstituted democracy. Japan had been democratic before the war, but it was a new American-sponsored constitution. The idea that the constitution would outlaw war, that, of course, speaks to that sort of NATO point, because, of course, the idea that Germany would come back into a formal alliance was unthinkable in 1955. Well, giving Japan arms again in 1952 seemed unlikely. And yet, in fact, under what was known as the Dodge Line, it became important to rearm Japan as well as communist China emerged in that context. So law, defense, commerce, all of these come together in a new sort of legal political structure. And yet China, of course, is in the middle of a cataclysm because the internal civil war ended with that communist revolution, which people hadn't foreseen, even the communists themselves, in 1945-46. And instead of course, becoming part of that wider American-sponsored Asian structure, instead, China, in Mao's phrase, the phrase of Chairman Mao, leans to one side. It goes with the Soviet Union. And in that context, things like Japanese war crimes become part of a new method of talking about socialist justice. So in fact, part of this involves show trials and people, being executed summarily, as you might expect. Part of it, less expectedly perhaps, involves psychological retraining, shinao, brainwashing, as the term has become, in which war criminals, Japanese war criminals, as well as KMT nationalist war criminals is a term the communists use, I'm not endorsing it, merely passing it on, were put through re-education systems that essentially forced them to kind of reassess their own actions. And this was shown as a way of trying to suggest that they weren't just engaging in revenge, but creating a new socialist human being. And that was part of the way in which China was trying to present itself as not just different from the West, but also actually from the Soviet Union, a division which would eventually lead, of course, to the split between those two communist superpowers.
You mentioned commerce. We're going to go to questions from members in a moment. But Ben, I want to just go to you for a second. Where a lot of times when we talk about the rules-based order, a lot of people, what they're talking about is trade. And and that emerges in this period. But, you know, the development of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, it's not quite as simple as having a conference and everybody sets it up. It's a bit different than the other institutions, the other financial institutions that emerged from this period.
It is. So the original idea, which was developed during Roosevelt's third term, was for an ITO, an international trade organization, that was in many ways even deeper than the WTO. It got into areas like labor market operation that have been long considered toxic today. But by the time we get to 47, when the GATT is agreed, it's a much narrower in structure in terms of what it actually covers. It doesn't have much institutional support, but very, very important in distinguishing it from the WTO, and in my view, is the reason for its longevity and success. Remember, it endured for half a century and then was promoted into a World Trade Organization, is that the United States, by the time we get to 47, insists on some systemic compatibility. That is, we welcome the Soviets in, but only if they meet the rules. The purpose of the GATT is to integrate market economies, so the Soviets will have to agree to meet non-discrimination rules, will have to agree to tight transparency provisions, no export subsidies, et cetera. And the Soviets are not going to meet these terms, so they're kept out. So the GATT is a much smaller organization than the WTO. It only has 23 members, but it's cohesive because of this systemic compatibility. And I think as we're going to have a session on the contemporary world later, but I think the big lesson we can learn as we look to the future of what the WTO might become is the importance of this systemic compatibility.
Now, just keeping on our theme for a moment, what are the American choices in that development that you would highlight? Was there even a choice, a moment when we've decided this is how it's going to look? You mentioned the WTO being a promotion. Is it a promotion, or is it a lateral movement, or?
Well, the WTO is definitely a promotion. It deepens the organization significantly. It expands its remit into intellectual property, into services, et cetera. But most importantly, it creates a supranational element that had never been experienced in these international institutions before, in the so-called dispute settlement mechanism. This is a completely independent body. This is not just negotiations and mediation, but it makes decisions independently. And over time, it sort of developed its own common law, which you might look at as being a positive thing from one direction. In other words, the negotiating parties behind the WTO weren't able to agree on concrete language, so the judges on the appellate body for the dispute settlement mechanism were basically creating their own law over time. Eventually, that led to resistance from the United States, which was arguing with some fairness that if the WTO can't discipline China's behavior, you have to give us leeway to respond to that in order to protect our own industry. You, the appellate body, should not be writing new law in order to restrict our ability to defend ourselves.
I feel like we've barely gotten started, and yet we're not even at Vietnam, and yet it's time to turn to members. But Rana, it looked like you had
Jeremy also had
yeah,
a
And Jeremy,
like,
that's one line from each of us,
yeah.
just to say that when we talk about American choices, the alternative you could see was what happened to Mao's China at that time, where it joined Stalin's world socialist economic system, which essentially turns into barter. China at that time needs steel to build, railways, roads, all the things that a new growing state needs. It basically buys the steel by selling the Soviet Union frozen pork. In other words, it's almost goods for goods. And that's the alternative to being embedded in the world of the GATT, Bretton Woods, and so forth. That's one of the choices.
It's barter.
It becomes barter at times, yeah. Frozen pork for all.
The Comecon is essentially barter as well.
Exactly so.
Jeremy?
So, Amy, I just wanted to double down on your question about choices, because I think it's very important that as good historians, we recognize there were choices. Things didn't have to turn out the way they did. This was not some teleology, some end of history at the end of World War II or at the end of the Cold War, for that matter. There was a long and deep line of protectionists that remained powerful within American society through the 1950s and 60s, and a strong line of quasi-isolationists, not isolationists in the Charles Lindbergh form, but still quasi-isolationists. One could imagine a world where if Dwight Eisenhower had not run for president in 1952, where Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, was elected president, who was partial to tariffs in some mechanisms and was also somewhat isolationist as well. And you could have had a very different trajectory to American politics. The Bricker Amendment almost passed until it led to a point where the United States would have been congressionally mandated to withdraw forces from Europe. There was a very strong undertow to American internationalism. And this does not justify any of the Trump behavior today, but it is to say that that undertow has been there, and what we're seeing of it bubble to the surface today is not all historically created in social media. Much of it is there from an American public, particularly in certain regions of the country, that distrusts the military commitments we've made overseas and distrusts a world of free trade that is connected to deindustrialization. That's there at the end of World War II as much as the internationalism that we've been talking about right now.
It's such an important note to go into questions on. So at this time, I would like to invite members in New York and on Zoom to join our conversation with their questions. And a reminder that our meeting is on the record. We'll take the first question here in New York, and say who you are when I call on you. Michael, do you?
President's prerogative, I guess. One historical comment I wanted to make, and then a question, and just to build on something Jeremy talked about earlier. Dwight Eisenhower, as you said before, between being general and being president, was president of Colombia, which proved not to be a great job even back then. But while he was president of Colombia, he ran a study group here at the council. And the purpose of the study group was to say, what more should we do with Europe beyond the Marshall Plan? And what they came up with, now, first of all, he was a terrible leader of the study group. They could hardly ever meet. They couldn't reach consensus. But what they came up with was the idea of NATO. And he became the first Supreme Allied Commander. So at least he got a job out of it, and sent him out of the country for a couple of years before he came back to run for president. My question is, maybe to Ben primarily, during this whole time, you write about it in your book, there's still this view out there that we should share our nuclear knowledge with the Soviets, with others, including the Soviets. And that was a stream that was going on in American politics, and lots of scientists and others promoting that precisely at the time that we were coming to a different view of the Soviet Union. How did that come together, and where the changing perception of the Soviet Union meets the desire to share our technology with other countries and brings that to an end?
So that all comes to a head back to the beginning of our discussion in 1946. The Truman administration creates the so-called Baruch Commission to look at precisely this issue. How do we control nuclear proliferation? And they come up with a scheme that, looking back on it today, was really quite sophisticated. Basically, it would be a phased agreement where the Soviets would agree to international inspections, in return for which, stage by stage, the United States would first put its weapons into some sort of UN quarantine. Eventually, they might be dismantled, but it was tit for tat, stage for stage. But as you can imagine, the domestic debate in the United States blew up. On the left, you had people like Henry Wallace, who were claiming that the United States was refusing ever to denuclearize while demanding that the Soviets, open up the most intimate aspects of their society to American interrogation. He got that, as I found in writing my book, from Pravda. The people who were advising him when he was Commerce Secretary for Truman were Soviet agents. On the right, you had people who argued that we should absolutely not be giving up our atomic knowledge. And given Soviet behavior, it is absolutely essential that we maintain our weaponry. Interestingly enough, Henry Wallace, after the beginning of the Korean War, said it was a jolly good thing that the United States had not given up its atomic weapons because we may need them now. And wrote a fascinating piece in the New York Times in 1952 called Why I Was Wrong.
Alex?
Alexandra Starr with International Crisis Group. Thank you. This has been terrific. In terms of lessons learned, what we can bring to this particular moment, it did seem, Jeremy, that your comment about the role Congress played, yeah,
Yeah.
right, the role Congress played in the formation of the Marshall Plan and NATO, does that hint that perhaps this isolationist movement or moment we are in the United States, one way potentially out of it down the road is to make sure that the legislative branch plays a more robust role than it certainly is playing now, but even more so, going forward?
Yes. How much more can I say that? Look, the founders never intended for presidents to be able to conduct war willy-nilly on their own. They expected that presidents would, at times, have to react to a truly imminent threat. Even during the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington had to go hat in hand to states to get volunteers. He couldn't just send his own forces in. Since 1945, one of the really negative consequences in the militarization of American policy, and all of us as experts have to some extent contributed to it, is the centralization of power in the executive. We all like working with the executive because you can get things done faster. State Department is always bureaucratic. The Defense Department is a behemoth. I can't even find my way around the building when I'm there, right? So there's clearly an expedience in working with executives, particularly when we like those executives, whether they're named Obama or Trump or whoever else. But in reality, this is undermining our democratic system. And at the end of World War II, we see a moment where Congress really did play a central role. And I think we should be coming back to that, especially for those who are critical of U.S. foreign policy.
Jeremy, I wonder if you could draw those two first questions together in a way. How much is the story of the growth of the executive tied to the growth of the bomb as one of the central points in war, in diplomacy? Congress doesn't have a guy with a nuclear football following it around.
Well, yes. This is the justification given in the National Security Act of 47, and it is one of the dynamics, but I would say it's more of a rationalization than a driving force. The true force you find in the archives for the centralization of executive power for foreign policy is the desire of presidents to be able to make decisions without consulting Congress, often decisions that have nothing to do with nuclear matters, and quite frankly, the desire of members of Congress not to have to take a tough stand on any particular issue. The Korean War is front and center in this. Robert Taft, I feel like I'm the advocate of Robert Taft today, and I'm usually not. But Senator Robert Taft criticizes President Harry Truman for not coming to Congress for a declaration of war. And he says this takes us down a road where Congress will play less and less of a role. Taft is astounded to find, and this will echo it today, that many members of Congress are happy for Truman to take this on without coming to Congress because they don't want to have to vote on this. That is a dereliction of duty by the first branch of our government. And back to Alexandra's question, regardless of what side you're on, our foreign policy will be stronger and more democratic if we have more congressional activity and congressional consent. We lose many wars, or we don't win many wars, because the American public is not behind them. You can't get the public behind a military engagement if you don't have Congress involved. I thought we learned that in Vietnam. It seems we have to learn that lesson again.
And I just point out that Truman, as of 46, had no choice but to cooperate with Congress because it was Republican controlled. But having said that, Arthur Vandenberg, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who had been a staunch isolationist, was absolutely instrumental in pushing through the Marshall Plan. Without him, it would never have been legislated. And going back to Jeremy's point earlier, he actually improved it. And he was absolutely central to the creation of NATO and building the credibility of a military alliance with the American public. It could not have been done without him.
Thank you. Earl Carr, representing CJPA Global Advisors. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. The United States used nuclear bomb in 1945 to bring the war to an end sooner. Were nuclear weapons ever thought of being used in the Korean War?
Jeremy, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. So there was some discussion. They were never seriously considered by President Truman, but he did have some sloppy rhetoric. There is a press conference he gives. Ben will remember the date. I think it's October, where he's asked by a reporter, "Will you use nuclear weapons, atomic weapons in Korea?" And Truman says, "Every weapon's on the table." And Clement Attlee gets on a plane almost immediately and flies from London to Washington, which was the last thing Harry Truman wanted. In fact, there was no one he wanted to meet with less than Clement Attlee at that point. And there were individuals, of course, most infamously General Douglas MacArthur, who spoke about using atomic weapons there. But there was never any serious consideration at the level of actual policy. It was all contingency planning and rhetoric. And the main reason was that there just wasn't a feasible way to do this. What were you going to accomplish? Were you going to make North Korea radioactive? There were still American forces there. What were you going to do? And this has been the problem throughout the Cold War. How do you make nuclear weapons usable? Perhaps Vladimir Putin has figured that out. Perhaps Israel has, but it's never been usable as a weapon for the United States.
Quick additional line on this. One of the things that happens in the Korean War in China as war temperature rises is that rumors sweep the countryside that young men and women are being kidnapped and their bodies are being used to create atomic bombs. Now, this, of course, has absolutely no basis in reality whatsoever, but it's an example of the way in which a very poor agrarian country in which communications was still in some ways very basic nonetheless heard about the atomic bomb. The rumors of this extraordinary new technology made their way even down to the peasants in the Chinese countryside, but they built them into folk tales and superstitious stories to try and fit them into their own worldview to explain other events that were going on around them they couldn't quite fathom.
Including the mystery, in a way, of American power.
That too, although actually part of it, just to add to that, is that it was the beginning of suspicion with the Soviet Union. One of the rumors was Soviet agents who were actually going around the countryside, kidnapping little boys and girls and turning them into atomic weapons. So even early on, they weren't quite sure what all these Russians were doing there.
All right. Right there.
Mojuba Olufunke Okome. I teach political science at Brooklyn College. And I'm just wondering about the fact that the world has changed since the 40s and 50s. So there are new players, or the old players, their force structure has changed. And then, the whole new rules-based order question, it never included all the actors. It's just about the very powerful countries with hegemonic power. So, what kind of responses rationale for the other non-powerful actors in this system? What kind of commitment should they have to the system that has never considered them as important, only as like pawns in the big powers games?
So perhaps a quick word on this, because actually the Cold War, the period we're talking about, the 50s, 60s, 70s, is an extraordinary moment for the beginning of those alternative systems of governance, which we now think of as the global south. I mean, this panel's about the Cold War, so we'll stick to that. But when China's communists won in 1949, as is well known, they were not included in the UN system. And in fact, Taiwan held the seat until 1971 at the UN. So the PRC, the People's Republic of China, had to find other ways to develop into the world system. And there's a lot of interest even now in 1955, not just because of NATO and the entry of Germany, but the Bandung Conference, which was the first gathering of Afro-Asian countries, the post-colonial countries that were mostly at that stage actually Asian, but African countries were beginning to get independence too. And in that world, it was China and India that were fighting for leadership, whether it would be a much more doctrinaire communist path backed up by the Soviet Union, but already with the idea in China's mind that they would be leading as a non-Western power in the way that they didn't quite believe the Soviets could do, particularly under Khrushchev, who Mao did not respect as a leader. Famously, Mao invited Khrushchev to his swimming pool in Beijing, and Khrushchev had to kind of be there in his swimming trunks on the side with paddling because he wasn't very good at swimming, whereas Mao actually swam many lengths and humiliated
what
him.
about in that, work into that idea about America's role in that, which is ambiguous.
It's ambiguous to some extent, but it's also absent in some ways, because when India, for instance, puts itself forward as a potential leader, it does so with the idea it's going to be a neutral player. It's a democracy. And of course, you know, America has that relationship. People like John Kenneth Galbraith in the Cold War is sent as American ambassador. He's sent as American ambassador to India. And yet they have a warm relationship with the Soviet Union as well. So I think a lot of leaders, the Kennedy administration certainly found India a sort of troublesome actor to deal with in some ways. But even more than that, in 1967, Richard Nixon, who's then a candidate for president, publishes perhaps one of the most famous essays in foreign affairs, I guess coming out of this building in a sense, Asia After Vietnam, in which he says, we cannot afford to leave China forever out of the family of nations. And the point is that I would say that, you know, that made great sense in terms of the US. But actually, China had not been left out of the family of nations at that point. It was having different conversations with the Vietnamese, with the Indians, with the post-colonial countries like Indonesia, and it was bringing it back into that international system with the UN. And finally, the US, relatively late in the day, in 1979, reopening relations that really marked that Cold War reorientation, where the US and China would finally be talking to each other again.
All right. Annie?
Amy, can I come in on that for a second? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can I come in for a second? Yeah, I just wanted to make the point in response to that question that I think it's a very fair criticism of the Cold War, post-World War II world order, as Rana and others have written about, right? That it is weighted in the direction of the United States and American interests. But I would also say that one of the key transformations is the recognition among American policymakers that other parts of the world that are not great powers matter. They might not matter equally, but they matter to American thinking. America cares about the General Assembly of the United Nations. World opinion, as Wilson had called it decades earlier, matters. Maybe not as much as the opinion of great powers, but it still matters. And what's striking about the world today is not that it's uneven in its distribution of power and influence. That should not surprise anyone. But that the strongest power, the largest power, is acting as if the opinions of 3/4 of the world don't matter. That's a real reversal of the last 80 years. And to a historian, that's particularly striking in this moment.
You know, we have about 1 minute left. We have 10 minutes left.
10 minutes left.
We're fine. Annie, sorry. Thank you.
Congratulations on this amazing panel. One of my favorite events that we did at the CFR recently was examining the best and the worst policies decisions, which was also fantastic. I wanted to ask you 2 what-if questions, Rana, as long as we have you here. Sure. One is this. there was actually a very big debate in Japan, and it wasn't inevitable that Japan, albeit fascist at the time, would do the tripartite agreement and end up on Germany's side. Were American policies that led to the so-called ABCD surrounding Japan, meaning
American, British, Chinese, Dutch. Yep.
exactly, that alliance is against us, and that was the paranoia that led to that? Question one. Question two is I spent most of my adult life in Hong Kong, and I had always been led to believe when I was first a student doing my graduate work that the KMT was the most corrupt organization on the planet. I now go back to Beijing, and people always say China would be better off today if the KMT had won. Do you agree with that?
So, Henny, you were putting the tough questions. Because of time, I'll give you very brief answers to those. But if you could grab me during the coffee break, I'd love to hear your answers to those same questions. Very briefly. The first one, I mean, people here will know, that's actually about the pre-war period, actually, and the lead up to Pearl Harbor and the ultimate...
And the Tripartite Pact
and the Tripartite
was
Pact.
in the fall of 40...
So my short answer to you is that I don't think that's where the trigger point comes, because essentially Japan, even during its democratic period in the 1920s, was already using military power to become informally, but actually in practice highly dominant in much of North China, Manchuria and North China. And that encroaching sense of not allowing China to develop as a stable nation state was really the point of origin of much of the American decisions. In the end, the oil embargoes, the things that finally put Japan over the edge to launch the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, are happening because the FDR administration, Cordell Hull and others, are pushing much harder on saying, you're pushing too hard on China, you need to end the war there, you need to let China actually be open door, as John Hay put it in an earlier era. And Japan said, no, this is our backyard, we're going to deal with it that way. So that was part of that second thing. Second, in terms of whether China would be better or worse off, and I'd love to have names of who this person in Beijing who told you was that they're many. Okay, well, perhaps since it's not a closed door session, I'll ask you the names in private over the coffee break. But I would say that actually one of the way I put it is this. I've written in one book, and I'll say now, if the ghosts of Chairman Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were or are wandering around China today, looking at the skyscrapers and the high-speed railway and the kind of, way in which the country's converted to this sort of, extraordinarily technocratically competent but highly authoritarian place, Mao, I think, would be holding his hands and saying, no, that's not what I meant at all. Whereas Chiang Kai-shek was saying, yeah, that's kind of what I intended.
Holly, do we have?
Yes, my name is Tony Carnes. I'm with a journal called A Journey Through NYC Religions. I noticed that, my question is based on Truman framed the conflict and engagement with the world of faith versus totalitarian atheism. You also have the Church World Service work with the Marshall Plan, and the Vatican work to establish Christian democratic parties. So I'm wondering if the panel could, since this is part about global engagement after the war, talk about the role of religion in that global engagement.
Jeremy, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, religion was important. There have been a number of good books on this by William Inboden and Andrew Preston and various others. Religion was important to American policymakers because they believed that the West represented something that was philosophical and eschatological, not just material. But religious doctrine, theology was not important to them. So they were not fighting a Christian war. They were fighting what they saw as a war to protect Western civilization that had Judeo-Christian, and those who were more sophisticated recognized also Muslim elements to it. But they were not fighting a religious doctrinal conflict in any sense of the word. These were men who were general believers. I'm talking about Truman, Eisenhower, and others. They were Presbyterians in many cases. Most of the CFR early membership were Presbyterians, in fact. And they believed in a sort of monotheistic world that the United States was somehow defending. But they didn't think that religious doctrine was what this was about. And they never never believed they were defending a Christian nation, not at all. Why on earth, otherwise, would we be a multicultural entity in contrast to the fascist world that we were fighting? So it was religion, but not in a doctrinal way. It was more in a sort of general set of monotheistic Judeo-Christian beliefs.
You know, with your permission, I want to maybe expand your question to what you might call civic religions as well. There was definitely an idea that some of the necessary post-war institutions were cultural ones. You know, UNICEF, the idea of World Heritage, world sites. Ben, do you want to talk or?
I'll let Rana go on that one. I might put in a few words on the domestic relevance of religion. I was quite struck in writing my Wallace book how often religion came up in the debates about who could or could not be vice president, for example. In 40 and 44, I was surprised to see how strongly FDR wanted Jimmy Burns from South Carolina. It was a conservative Southerner. But twice he was ruled out because he was a Catholic who had married a Protestant and converted himself. And this was seen as being offensive to millions of Catholics in the United States. And believe it or not, FDR and his advisors thought that this could cost him the presidency. But if they had not had these debates, I'm quite sure that Roosevelt would have won in 44 anyway, and Jimmy Burns, rather than Harry Truman, would have become president on Roosevelt's death in April of 45. And that, too, raises quite interesting counterfactuals.
And Christianity inserts itself in some rather unexpected ways in America's Cold War engagements in Asia, because if you look hard enough, there are a lot more Christian leaders than you might think. China was ruled by a Christian leader called Chiang Kai-shek, who was a Methodist. He was a Confucian as well. But actually, if you read his diaries, his Christianity, which he was converted to when he married Madame Chiang Kai-shek, was extremely sincere in terms of reading Psalms, thinking about how they were important to his understanding of a new kind of civic religion, which in some ways he thought might be pleasing to the Americans. Bao Dai, of course, there's a Christian elite within the context of a Catholic elite in Vietnam, which of course stands in strong contrast to the Buddhist masses. And that division was one of many things that split the ability of the United States to be able to create any kind of regime that would last there. If I remember correctly, Syngman Rhee, I think, in Korea was Christian, I think, as well, which, again, is a larger grouping within the Korea of that time. But Christianity turns up in unexpected and, I think, politically important places in that American Cold War project in Asia.
And you suggest in the example of Vietnam that may have kept us in some ways from being completely clear about.
I think it is certainly the
were.
case that the Catholic elite in the Vietnam or the South Vietnam of that time found itself separated from the wider population for a variety of reasons, but the Catholic-Buddhist divide was certainly one of those reasons, and I think it was known about certainly by the CIA and others, but how to navigate it became the problem.
Now we have now just about a minute left. So if there's a super quick question that we could still get from anybody in the room.
Yeah.
I'm Tom Walsh, HJ International Graduate School. Was there enthusiasm about the UN in these early days, a honeymoon period, or was it already seen as this is going to be a tough job with these permanent five and the kind of Cold War emerging? Just trying to get the
give like
feelings of that time.
One word answers on this.
My one-liner is, the fact that we had the Korean War as a UN police action was a product of the fact the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at the time, which suggests that even quite early on, relations were not entirely friendly. So, yeah, a lot of it sets in early.
The first major Security Council conflict comes in the spring of 46, when the Iranians complained that the Soviets won't take their troops out. And it was influential. The Soviets did not enjoy that attention. And it is one of the reasons why they did decide to back off and withdraw their troops.
This has been a great session, and thank you so much for all of your questions.